I think they're getting better. So for the first few years, I'm like, I'm coming here to heal my entire year.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, we get the
Yeah.
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 It's so easier.
I'm not sure if I can grow another foot for you, but
I think the
you might go up.
only thing that's there's a prerequisite here that
In the
good. Louder. Louder.
Yeah, that's good. Hopefully.
You just have to talk loud. I know you can do it. You know, there's an
Can I turn on and off?
the mic.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Do you know that there's an actor artist named Toor?
Yes. I hate that guy.
So I literally, when I asked for this flyer to be developed by Kara, she's like, "Can you sell on Toor?" It was really funny.
You know the worst part. Go ahead. I'll tell you.
السلام عليكم. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Welcome home, everybody. Good to see everybody. Alhamdulillah. Especially on these literally cold nights. I know that I make fun of the Dallas weather for not being legitimately cold, but this is really cold, guys. I don't know what we've done. We did something. But alhamdulillah, I'm happy that we were able to make it. Again, if you haven't gotten yourself something to eat, please feel free, inshallah. Just some pizza to keep you going during tonight's session, inshallah. Tonight's session is the first of hopefully, many with a mentor and a good friend of mine. Well, two of them actually, mashallah. Dr. Salmaan Toor, and many of you may have heard of Ustad Ubaidullah Ahmed. Anybody? He teaches Arabic full-time at the Qalam Seminary. He's the year one instructor for the Arabic program. So if anyone wants to study Islamic studies at the Qalam Seminary, there's like a 9 out of 10 chance that they're going to have to go through him, the gauntlet. So mashallah, he is someone who's been teaching full-time now for, like almost 7-8 years. He's been doing this, alhamdulillah. And all of our students that come to us later on in the later years, they've benefited from him, mashallah. So he's here, he's joining us because this is something that we were talking about over lunch today, actually, a topic that he enjoys. And he was excited because he also knows Dr. Toor, who is, again, a mentor and a friend of mine. He actually lives and resides in Knoxville, Tennessee. He did his training, initially, he got his undergraduate degree from the University of Tennessee, and then he went to William & Mary University that's in Virginia. Right? Yeah. And he did his master's there and then returned back to Tennessee, I think in like 2012. You said 2012? No? Oh, 2008. Oh, mashallah. Youngest student ever, PhD program. And he got his doctorate in psychology, right? So he's a clinical psychologist, mashallah. And he's someone that is heavily involved, not only in the clinical side at his center, the Family Center of Knoxville, but also in the research side. And he's really involved in community work. He's somebody that has many different sort of touch points in the community, whether it's like the masjid or the Islamic school, and as also just like a mentor for the MSA students there. So when I was there in Knoxville, Tennessee, now that was like 9 years ago, it was a while. He was someone that was constantly a resource in the community. And so when I started to think about what Roots could do to start to address and talk about mental health and spiritual health and the relationship that there is, or is there a relationship between those two things? There was absolutely nobody that I was going to have besides Dr. Toor. I was really, really, key on that. And I think I've been asking you for a year, more than that. He was actually in New Zealand when I asked him, living there during COVID. And I was like, when you come back, whenever that is, number one, bring a koala. Number two, I need you to do this program with me because I think it'd be really important, inshallah. So welcome, Dr. Toor, Salmaan, however you want to be referred to, inshallah. Tonight's program is meant to be something really, really easygoing, conversational. So Ustad Ubaidullah and I are going to be passing the mic back and forth. And Dr. Sal is going to have his own mic over there because he's really the reason why everyone's here. But I want to ask you first, before we talk about it, when you hear about spiritual and mental health and relationships between the two of them, what's the importance of even having this conversation? Why do you think that this needs to happen? Especially given your clinical work, you work with Muslims, right? And people who are not Muslim as well. So you work across the spectrum. what do you see in the mental health arena, particularly with spiritual conversations, that is something unique in those moments?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Before we answer that question, we have to clear something up. Koalas are from Australia,
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
not New Zealand. For any of the people that if they're watching from down under, they're probably highly offended right now. So, but if you've learned anything, you're going to learn that today. But yeah, the idea of spiritual and mental health, and even physical health and whatnot. So working with Muslims and even non-Muslims. If you know where Knoxville, Tennessee is, it's right smack dab in the Bible Belt. And so spirituality is a way of life, right? So inshallah, when you think of your deen, right, it's something you can't separate from your mental health or your physical health or those kind of things. Like when someone tries to ask you, how do you live a spiritual life? It's, at least for me, it's very difficult to answer. And, spiritual compared to religious, right? Where it's like, oh, I pray 5 times a day, that kind of thing. But in a lot of the work that we do, you see kind of, whether it's a Muslim or a non-Muslim, but the struggles that people are having or the resilience that they're having, right? The two are tied and intertwined. And so I don't think you can really talk about one without the other. And even if you're not, part of monotheistic religions or whatnot, the spiritual is also, right, something that, I believe in, whether it's nature, whether it's college football, whether, whatever it is kind of thing. And so there's also that part of it, right, where it's kind of like, I can't explain it, it's intangible, but I know it affects my life. And so a lot of the work that we do kind of overlaps when it comes to spiritual and mental kind of areas of an individual's life.
So for those of you who didn't get the college football reference, Sal's from, Dr. Toor is from Knoxville, Tennessee, where literally I think the largest church there is the college football stadium. On Saturday, it's 113,000 seats.
We're down to 100,000.
100, yeah. So
trying to milk money on
it's 100,000 seats. The team is notoriously bad. I mean, every year everyone thinks they're going to win, but I want you to understand, like, it's sold out. And it gets to the point where I was once, when I was there, I was the chaplain of the volunteer chaplain at University of Tennessee, and I was on a panel of religious experts, and we talked about sports and religious studies. And the rabbi was complaining because he said, as the religion that has their Sabbath day on the Saturday, that's when college football games are. And he's like, it sucks. Like, no one attends unless it's a bye week or something. And then the pastor who was there said, well, people only attend my service on whether or not we win or lose. Like, if we win, they're all in a good mood, they come to church. If we lose, they're all upset, maybe hungover, I don't know, and they don't come to church. And then it was my turn. I said, well, as Muslims, Friday is our day of the week. That is the Sabbath, the sanctified day. And everyone attends because we all pray for the Vols to win. And so I said, it's clear that Islam is a religion that accepts college football. Yeah, so, it's evident. So we all just need to believe La ilaha illallah. So that's what Sal was talking about. Was it really for some people? I mean, and we see it here with the Cowboys, right? Like, I mean, it was like a day of mourning after they, got knocked out of the playoffs. So, we chose tonight, when we talked on the phone, we talked about what could we talk about. We want this to be something that's beneficial, but at the same time, I think, especially with mental health, it just feels like this giant boulder that you don't really get much out of. You can just see it, you can appreciate it, but what do you walk away with, right? You guys know what I'm talking about a little bit. Like, it's just this giant and untouchable subject. So we settled on the number 4 with regards to, like, principles that people can talk about and learn about tonight. And these are things that Dr. Toor and I spoke about. Why is it important to have these, like, especially in someone's mental health and their wellness, why is it important to have obtainable goals, these achievable, measurable, but obtainable goals, as opposed to giving yourself, long-term goals that are really difficult to have milestones or checkpoints towards?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is like New Year's resolutions, right? Where we have like, oh, starting January 1st, I'm going to start training for a marathon, or, this thing and that thing. But what we kind of see with reachable and attainable goals, and we can talk about what exactly does that mean, right? Is if we can start to progress towards it and we can really see it, right? Then it has an impact, depending on the goal, but on our mental health, on our self-esteem, on our self-confidence, and, those kind of things. And so I think one of the things that kind of trips us up is sometimes we just talk about goals without really reflecting on it. And so, whether that's praying 5 times a day or volunteering every weekend or, writing in a journal every day and those kind of things, these are all things that sound, alhamdulillah, really amazing and we should absolutely strive for. But the other half of that is how do we reflect on, right, what's actually possible, what's realistic for me? Because we don't want to get into a cycle where we do something for a couple of days and then we stop. And then 2 weeks later, we add like 4 more things because we're feeling really motivated for about a day or an hour or that kind of thing. And then we don't reach those goals on a consistent level. And so you can see how this can spiral into this negative kind of loop. And so, so I think the first thing when you come up with goals, and alhamdulillah, goals are a great thing, and we know that's something that can be motivating. But to really ask yourself, what's a reasonable kind of thing to strive for?
And when you look at the Quran, Allah actually mentions something that I found to be amazing. So at the end of, I believe it's Surah Furqan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this person has acquired a lot of sins. And Allah basically mentions, all of these sins that we can't even necessarily imagine being a person who's committed all of them. That this person has committed, all kinds of indecencies, and they've neglected their relationship with Allah, and they've even gone to the points of like worshiping something else besides God, like devoting themselves to something else. And then Allah Ta'ala mentions that this person, that they will be, if they don't repent, they will be unfortunately subject to a grave punishment, okay, which we talked about. But then Allah Ta'ala says illa, which in Arabic is called istithna, it's the exception. And when a person has like an exception, it kind of makes your ears perk up. Because if somebody knows that there's going to be punishment or something difficult coming, then it's obviously very dark, it's dreary, and then you hear the exception and you say, okay, because that's where you want to be, right? Everyone in here is going to fail except, and then everyone starts listening. So Allah Ta'ala says that everyone who does this or has this rap sheet basically is going to fail except, it says, إِلَّا مَنْ تَابَ وَآمَنَ وَعَمِلَ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا فَأُولَٰئِكَ يُبَدِّلُ اللَّهُ سَيِّئَاتِهِمْ حَسَنَاتٍ. That except for a person who does 3 things. Number 1 is taba, which means to turn, literally, or to repent in a technical sense, to come back to Allah, to ask Allah to forgive you, to take that moment, to have that awareness. Number 2, وَآمَنَ, believe, reaffirm your belief, ask yourself, like, who am I? Like, what am I doing? And then this is the phrase that is interesting for goal setting. وَعَمِلَ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا. And they do deeds that are righteous. Now, when you look it up, Allah could have just said they do righteous deeds, or they do good deeds, or they do righteous things. But when in the Arabic language, when you put together the 2 verbs of the 2 forms of the verb amila amala, it refers to, in one meaning, a small amount, or like anything from it, basically, right? Anything at all. And so in that moment, Allah is saying, if you want to be forgiven from these grave, grave sins, just do something, right? Just do something. Does anyone here have a problem where if you can't accomplish something major, you just give up altogether? You guys have that? Is there a word for that in psychology? Giving up? Yeah.
That's the clinical term.
Yeah. So it's a reality. I mean, I've met people that have said, I don't pray because by the time I wake up, Fajr's over. And then I miss Dhuhr, and then I'm just kind of like, all right, well, 0 for 2, and I'll start tomorrow. I'll start next week. Or diets. Anyone here fail with diets? Right? Like that's just something. It's a reality. Or spending money. I'll start saving next month. Or being better about calling people, or whatever. You set this very massive goal, and you start to see yourself unable to carry the weight of it, and then as a result of that, you either postpone it, you reschedule, or you just give up altogether. In the Quran, Allah mentions that if you want to take on the massive goal of repentance for a lifelong of sins, a lifetime of sins, then you have to start somewhere. And Allah does not expect a person to make up for all the mistakes they made in that one moment. You just have to start, right? So there is redemption. Like God has redemption for people, and it doesn't have to match the mistakes that they made right away, right? The goal is to get there, but the first step is just to even say the word Allah, right? Just to say Alhamdulillah, just to say Astaghfirullah. There have been many people that have been forgiven, and the Prophet ﷺ told us it's because of one word, right? So interesting when it comes to goal setting. So, Billy, you want to share anything?
See me writing a lot.
Yeah.
So one of the things on the point you just made is, if you look at the actions that we're asked to do in Islam, they're all qualitative. It's the quality of my good deeds, not necessarily how many you do, right? So it's the quality of the forgiveness that you seek and how sincere it is versus you have to seek forgiveness for as many sins as you committed. It doesn't necessarily work that way, right? So the quality of the action, focusing on even one action but doing it well, has a lot more weight, and it's not necessarily about number. So that's kind of something that came to mind. But I had a question for Dr. Sal related to the goal setting, because I feel like we went into goal setting, and how do we determine what are like mental health goals for ourselves? Like, how do you assess someone's quote unquote mental health? Like, what does it mean to be in good standing when it comes to your mental health? And what's a goal that I'm striving for?
Yeah, that's a question that I feel like we face every session. And so I think the first thing is when you think of being mentally healthy, right? Hopefully what comes to mind is not smiling all the time or just, turn that frown upside down, focus on the positive, those kind of things, right? So when I think of being mentally healthy, the idea is, how can I feel my feelings, right? How can I understand my thoughts and my behaviors and things like that, but not dismiss them, right? How can I do this, whether they're happiness or joy or sadness or anger and all these kind of things, and recognize what I'm doing, right? And express them in a healthy way, right? In a healthy way, meaning, right, maybe verbally or even in your behavior and, those kind of things. And just reflecting on, okay, why did that come up for me, right? Or what's happening for me that, yesterday this didn't bother me, but today it did, right? And so a lot of what we do is trying to sit there and just reflect on, kind of what's been going on and whatnot. And then when you think about, any type of mental health disorder, in order for it to be at a clinical level, right? So you hear people talk about, oh, the Cowboys lost, I'm so depressed, right? And you're like, well, to be clinically depressed, this has to affect you for 2 to 6 months kind of thing, right? It has to affect your appetite.
Some people it does.
Yeah. And so that's where then you might be depressed, right? But if it's one of those, like, oh, this is the worst day ever, right? And the words that we use, just by it being the worst day ever means that you're not clinically depressed, right? If it's over and over and over again, then maybe. But besides that, right, the idea of, as it's a mental health disorder if it affects your daily life, if you can't get up and go to school, or if you can't get up and go to work, or if you're eating too much or too little, or if you're sleeping too much or too little, or the things that you used to do for fun are no longer fun to you anymore, or you don't reach out to your friends and those kind of things and whatnot. And you can see that mental health is really messy, and I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, right? If you break your arm, we get an x-ray and it's right there, and we put a cast on it, and alhamdulillah, your body is like a miracle. It heals itself a lot of the time, right? But mental health, right, for some people it's, I slept 14 hours, and I've got insomnia. So I try to explain to people that's where you have to look at yourself, your unique self, and not to compare yourself to someone else or this kind of thing, because every single person is different and unique. And so alhamdulillah, I mean, that's an amazing thing when you really think about that. And so to be able to say, what is my uniqueness, right? How does that impact myself? Maybe your spirituality, your relationships, your family, all those kind of things. So part of, inshallah, if people feel this way that work with me, part of when they come in is they are able to reflect on their uniqueness and better understand themselves.
So you mentioned that, Allah Ta'ala created everyone differently. I mean, reflection of that is just everyone's fingerprint, their DNA. It's so unique to them. It's absolutely unique to them. And one of the first principles that you and I spoke about, we talked about this program, was the idea of a mentally well and a spiritually well soul is a person that has, and this is a tough concept to discuss because it can go quickly into like the bad side of things, but confidence, right? Confidence. And you said that the opposite of that could be like self-doubt, this pervasive, persistent self-doubt. Anyone here, maybe you did or have or still do or know somebody that struggles with confidence and self-doubt? Anyone here, like when you're in a professional meeting, you start apologizing before you present? Anybody? Okay, or like you just start to make excuses for why something isn't as good as it could have been before you've even shown somebody? Like you serve them food that you cooked for hours and hours, and then they take a bite and you're like, it needs more salt, right? So all of these are like these minor manifestations of this very ubiquitous and pervasive issue, which is essentially like a balance beam. You know, as Muslims especially, we learn that arrogance is one of the fatal sins. So Shaitan, his arrogance inflated, and it became so inflamed that it stopped him from being able to recognize truth as truth, right? That God is the one that should be worshipped. And instead he, debated God on whether or not he should bow, okay, to what God Ta'ala told him, Allah Ta'ala told him to bow to. So how do we, number one, establish what is confidence? What does it mean to be a confident person? Is that a bad thing? And where are the parameters of confidence? Like, where do we know that we're kind of waning too far into self-doubt that is destructive, or arrogance that is destructive? And how do we know that we're living kind of in that zone, that healthy zone?
I'm actually looking really forward to hearing you guys answer this from a spiritual side. But whenever I think about kind of, confidence, or what's the right amount of depression or happiness or anxiety or those kind of things, right? Because there are studies that show you don't want to be too anxious, right? If you have a test or a presentation or whatever, you don't want to be so anxious that you can't focus, right? But you don't want to be so chill that you're kind of like, what exam, whatever, I'll show up, that kind of thing. You want to be right in the middle. So one of the things that is really important to remember, right? And especially from an Islamic perspective, right? We have all these kind of beliefs and sayings of like, find that middle path, right? Moderation, those kind of things. And so when it comes to confidence, right, I think the first thing is, where is your confidence coming from, right? And so, and that idea of, is it coming from, my merits, whether they're, superficial or real or based on hard work or, those kind of things. But then also something considered kind of an extrinsic and intrinsic values. Has anyone heard of extrinsic and intrinsic values? I'm sure maybe in Psych 101 when you guys skipped that class. Right, so like an extrinsic value is, I want to do really well in this sales call because then I'll get my bonus and I'll get some money and I can go to, Mexico or, wherever people in Dallas go to vacation. And intrinsic value, right, is that idea of, this is just really important to me as a person, right? I'm not really concerned about the prestige or the money or the recognition or whatnot. I just really want to help kids learn how to read. And I don't care if anyone knows, but that's just really important to me, right? And so confidence, self-doubt, those kind of things, to really ask yourself, this is how I feel about myself based on, my paycheck or my grades or, these kind of things. And that's not to say those things don't matter, but is there balance in how I see myself? And in that idea of like, but I'm also, concerned about, am I an honest person or character or empathic or helpful, all these kind of things. And so, and I do think it's, are you overly confident? Are you, too much of a self-doubt or whatnot? I actually think narcissism is actually a good thing, right? When it's healthy, right? When you have a healthy amount of it. If you walk around thinking everyone should serve you and you walk on water and those kind of things, that's clearly not healthy, right? But if you have this sense of like, hey, I think I can do this. I think I could be really good at this, right? That's kind of a moderate approach to it. And so I think there's some words out there that we hear it and we're like, I don't want to be like that. And that's fair, right? Like a Texans fan, right? But it's how do I reflect on myself and say, am I doing a balanced approach? And I think the best way, two simple examples, like how much sleep should you get, right? 7, 8, 9 hours, something like that. And you can figure out if you're getting enough sleep based off of what?
When you wake up.
When you wake up, right? Or 2 hours later when you're yawning or you can't focus or these kind of things, or if you're super tired at 4 p.m. or, those kind of things. And then how can you figure out if you've eaten too much, right? I know everyone knows the answer to this, right? We have to like loosen our belt, or you feel bloated, or you have a stomach ache, or these. So Allah has created this machine, the human body, right, that is constantly giving you signals that are like, hey, you're hot, we're gonna start sweating, right? Or hey, you're full, I'm sending you signals that your stomach is full, or hey, you're sleepy, your eyelids are getting really heavy. And they're same things for emotions, right? You're angry, your fists are clenched up, right? Or you're gritting your teeth, or you're happy and you're feeling lighter and you're smiling and you're making eye contact and those kind of things. And so when you're trying to figure out these questions, right, just kind of take a moment and just kind of reflect on kind of where I'm at. And so.
So talking about how you view yourself, right? The Islamic perspective, we're going to hear about this a lot leading up to the month of Ramadan, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, "Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum," that the most noble of you is the one that is most God conscious, right? And that is an interesting thing because no one can see that. Your God consciousness is not on display, that your taqwa lives in your heart. And only you know that and Allah knows that, and you have to be honest with yourself, right? But then the question comes in, well, that's where my value comes from or my worth comes from a religious perspective. What happens when I mess up, right? When I do something wrong, when I have a lapse in God consciousness, then we get into the discussion of seeking forgiveness. And then it kind of goes back and forth. And sometimes Shaitan really convinces us, well, how could you seek forgiveness or how could you do this? And Shaitan pushes us towards that side of self-doubt of don't seek forgiveness. How dare you seek forgiveness? You did this so many times before. This is like the 100th time you're seeking forgiveness for the same thing and you're expecting to be forgiven. Like Shaitan feeds on self-doubt, right? Versus the other side, and we see this example in prophets, their understanding of forgiveness and their understanding of their relationship with Allah is very different, right? They're very hopeful. And I think for a lot of us, growing up, at least for me, I'll speak from a personal perspective, we just have an unhealthy understanding in terms of our spirituality, right? For example, we're taught, or I was taught at a young age, if you don't do this, Allah will punish you, right? How many of you heard that? That's a very scary thought, right? That's a very scary thought. And that's something that we learn at a young age. And it becomes difficult for us to be hopeful in Allah's mercy when seeking forgiveness, because in the back of my mind, the first thing I was ever taught about Allah was that He's going to punish me when I mess up, right? Versus if you kind of read the Quran on your own, try to put your biases to the side or what you've learned to the side, you'll see an overwhelming emphasis on Allah's mercy and Allah's forgiveness, right? Overwhelming. And even when Allah speaks about His punishment, He always speaks about His reward also, right? And one of the most beautiful ayat that reminds me of this is Ibrahim alayhi salam talking about Allah. He says, وَالَّذِي أَطْمَعُ أَن يَغْفِرَ لِي خَطِيئَتِي يَوْمَ الدِّينِ. He says, my Lord is the one that I'm hopeful He's going to forgive me on the day of judgment. How many of us think of forgiveness with that level of confidence? Like I did Tawbah sincerely, and I've gotten better. I've changed. Like I've broken habits. I've worked on it. I put in effort. And you should have confidence that you were forgiven. You should have confidence that on the day of judgment, Allah will forgive you. Prophet Ibrahim is saying this. He said, my Lord is the one who's so merciful, who's given me so much throughout my whole life that I've tried my best. I've sought forgiveness. So on the day of judgment, I have that same confidence and hope that He's going to forgive me on the day of judgment. Like He's talking about the day of judgment, which is a horrific event. The Quran describes it as such, but He has a very hopeful like tone and attitude when He's talking about it, which is something that is probably very hard for us to process and get there because we don't have that like nuance in our understanding, right? We're punishment, or it's like punishment or reward, and that's it. We don't try to find the balance.
It's a really good point. I think that whenever I hear like a perspective like the one that Ustad Ubaidullah gave, or the other side, which Dr. Toor gave, when he's, you know, I'm going to quote you on this, I think narcissism is a great thing. That's what he said. I'm just repeating what he said. That's right. That's right. Fake news. So, you know, I always, it's interesting. In Islam, we have constant reminders of Allah's mercy, Allah's forgiveness. We also have reminders of Allah's justice and the consequences that are there for those people who don't feel any sense of remorse. We have hadith where the Prophet ﷺ would tell us things about, you know, humbling yourself and remembering that you know, Allah Ta'ala literally says that you came from, you know, cloudy liquid from the loins of your parents, right? There's a famous story that's really funny that I always laugh at. There was a guy who bumped into Al-Hasan al-Basri. He's very famous, kind of like, you know, wealthy guy. I thought he was a big shot. He bumps into him, and you know, Hasan al-Basri, they physically bumped into each other. When I say bump, I'm not speaking like figuratively. They physically bumped into each other, and he looks at Hasan al-Basri, he's a scholar, and he says, do you have any idea who I am? Do you know who I am? Right? Kind of like, check yourself. And Hasan al-Basri says, yeah, I know exactly who you are. Right? And so the guy's like, okay. And he goes, yeah, you were some liquid that came out of your father, and then you were raised in the womb of your mother. You came out from, her private area. Then throughout your entire life, all you did was just eat and defecate. That's all you did. And then you're going to die and be buried, and worms are going to eat you. And the guy's like, dang. And just walked away. Now, why did Hassan al-Basri, the same scholar who knows all these verses about hope and optimism and all that, why did he respond like that? And then you have the Prophet ﷺ where he bumps into highway robbers, right, who are trying to capture him during the migration from Mecca to Medina. And they show up and they're literally about to capture him. And he looks at them and he says, who are you? And they said, Nahnu al-Muhanan, we are like disgraceful people, talking bad about themselves. He said, Bel antum al-Mukraman, you are noble people. You just have to fix this like whole highway robbery thing. So you have two stories, one from the Prophet ﷺ and one from an inheritor of the Prophet ﷺ, Hassan al-Basri. And you see like different responses to different moments, right? So on the first story, you have this dude being, destroyed because again, his predisposition was one of inflated self-importance. The confidence was too out of control, right? The little bit of narcissism didn't stay a little bit. It became like this massive, like uncontrollable. And that's where you have shaitan. I mean, shaitan's narcissism, his arrogance, his self-confidence, he was one of the greatest worshipers of Allah in the history of the world until he thought that it was because of him. And then when he was convinced that it's, I'm the greatest, right? Then when Allah said, well, you need to bow to this brand new creation that hasn't done anything, right? Adam alayhi salam was lifeless at the time. You need to bow to this new creation. Shaitan said, why? And he didn't do it. And Allah says, why didn't you do it? And he says, khalaqtani min nar wa khalaqtahu min ana khayrun min, I'm better than him. So it's interesting here how when you have a creature or creation that shows up with a presupposition of self-importance, the response we find Islamically is, you're nothing. And I think what Ustad Ubaidullah said, which is really key, is that if you hear that at the wrong time, it's destructive. But I think we all agree that there are times when people need to hear that. There are times when we need to hear, you got to slow it down a little bit. There are times when you need a flat tire in life, right? When Allah Ta'ala, there's a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, whoever raises themselves to Allah, meaning in their arrogance, Allah will humble them. And whoever lowers themselves to Allah, Allah will raise them. Allah will elevate that person, right? So we see a reciprocal relationship here. If I become too high on my own supply, right? Don't take that literally. Then all of a sudden I'm going to see that something will happen. Something will happen, right? But if I keep my head lowered and my sleeves rolled up and I just keep working away at myself, then Allah will give me honor and distinction where I least expected it. So Hassan al-Basri shook that guy down, and the Prophet ﷺ took a man who was a puddle of humility on the floor. I'm an evil person. And the Prophet ﷺ said, don't ever say that about yourself, right? You're not like that. So in the search for confidence and self-doubt, Dr. Sal mentioned something really amazing, which I think is important. Listening to your body, just like you listen to yourself when you're hungry or you're full or you're tired or you're listening to yourself. Allah Ta'ala gave us actually an internal compass. There's a hadith in which a person came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, how will I know whether this is good or bad? Like, how do I? And the Prophet ﷺ said, istafti qalbak. He said, ask your heart. The heart can give you the answer to these questions, right? Does anyone have any questions on the topic of confidence for Dr. Toor before we move on? Yeah.
So can we agree that narcissism is not healthy, but confidence is healthy? Because that's like saying, yeah, so that's my question.
Well, what's the definition of narcissism? Anyone?
Toxic confidence.
Okay, toxic confidence, that's fair.
Are you talking about like the clinical personality? Or
I don't know, are you?
I don't know. Are you?
Oh God, when two psychologists talk to each other. Here we go. Tell me how you feel about that. I'm just joking.
Well,
I feel like it's when the confidence actually hurts the people around you.
Mhm.
The repercussions of that confidence mean that you're kind of crushing those who are
Mhm.
in your path.
Yeah, that's right. Right, that's an unhealthy level, right? Now, if you want to define that as narcissism, that's fine. We can get to the nuance of it or whatnot, but but yeah, and I think that's the power of the words that we use, right? And so if someone says I'm a narcissist, right, you're gonna think like, oh, let's hang out, right? Or you're gonna be like, let me stay away from this person, right? But if someone says I'm really confident, right, or I'm confident that we can, do this thing or work on this project or whatnot, right? That feels very different. And so I think this is a good example of what are the words that we use to describe ourselves, to self-talk, right? We all self-talk, right? We all sit here and say things about ourselves and those kind of things, whether good or bad. And so that's the importance, especially in today's age where everything is it feels like it's ramped up and escalated. That's where it's really important to be mindful and reflective of what are the words that I'm using. And that's where I really like to listen to Ustad Abedullah and Ustad Abdul Murphy. That sense of like, okay, it can be translated this way in Arabic, but it actually means this, right? And that's a huge difference between this meaning and that meaning. And so it's the same thing of the words that you use for yourself, right? But to kind of piggyback on what Ustad Abedullah said about that nuance, right? That like there's a punishment side and there's a forgiveness side, right? I think we should try to find that nuance in every word that we use, right? That sense of like, can this be a good thing? Right? So one of the examples we'll do in my office is, can you empathize with a criminal? And people are like, yeah, I can understand why you would steal bread from a grocery store. It's like, okay, can you empathize with a murderer? And so, and what does empathy mean, right? Empathy doesn't mean like, I'm team murderer. I'm totally down with that now, right? But it means like, I can understand why that person might have done that. I'm not agreeing with it, but I can understand where they're coming from, right? And then how do we show that empathy to ourselves when, right? If we've been taught kind of like, oh, it's going to punish you, right? But the Quran clearly says, right? Actually, this guy, I think like 10 years ago, talked about Surah Fatiha, right? That's the surah that we recite the most. And is it mostly punitive or is it mostly forgiving? Right? And so, I mean, you can talk more about that, but that's where it's like, okay, if I believe in this faith with my heart, that like our ultimate creator is like the most forgiving entity possible, right? It's like every day I'm going to give you a chance, right? Every single day, every single prayer, every single moment, I'm giving you tons of chances. And even if you take it, alhamdulillah, and if you don't, alhamdulillah, but you're going to have more and more and more. Like, what are we doing to ourselves when we're like super critical, right? That doesn't mean we don't hold ourselves accountable, but when we, turn up the volume on the self-criticism and whatnot, like that certainly isn't Islam.
So what's the how does a person know when their self-confidence has become like toxic? Like what are some markers that a person can identify within themselves? Like, okay, it's this one thing to say like, I can do this, right? Versus, it's another thing to say, hey, look at me do this all the time. Or like, I'm the best at this. No one else knows what they're doing. What are some markers that you might have seen clinically or even in like, your training where self-confidence is no longer healthy? Because in Islam, there is, healthy self-confidence, right? But there's also healthy modesty and there's also blameworthy modesty. Some of the scholars wrote about this disease called blameworthy modesty, which they said is like, it's almost like fake modesty, not really fake, but more like it's inhibitive, oh, I'm nothing, like Allah will never even look at me, or like, I shouldn't do this. And we're not taught to be that way, right? We're taught to, walk that thin line between the side where we understand our humility and the side where we believe in the God-given gifts that he gave us. I mean, you guys ever look in the mirror and look at yourself and you're like, mashallah. You know what I mean? Come on, you guys are being way too humble now. You're like, I don't even own any mirrors, stuck for love, brother. All right? No, there are times when you like wear an outfit or get a haircut or this and that. I mean, like, we're social creatures by design, and there are times when you wear something that you like, or when you do your hair in a way that you like, or you get, a haircut or lined up or whatever. You're like, alhamdulillah, like takbir, Allahu Akbar to yourself, and your wife's like, stop talking to yourself again, you narcissist, right? So what are the markers to know like what is healthy appreciation of the self, which we believe in Islam is appreciation of the self that's directed to Allah. Like, that's why we say alhamdulillah. That's why we say mashallah, literally means that's what God wanted, right? If you like something, you're like mashallah. It's interesting because many of us think that that's like, oh yeah, that's for me. It's like, no, it's not for you at all, right? So how do we know? What are some markers that you would identify? No one's taking like, absolute definitive notes, but just curious.
I think they might be.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think if you kind of exclude the spiritual side of it, because you're right, like if we get to a place to where we're like, everything I have, everything I do is for Allah and it's because of Him, then like you're probably at a pretty good place. I think, for whatever word you want to use it, psychological or secular or whatnot, that idea of self-confidence, right? If it's too much, how do I know? I think one that speaks to being connected to other people, right? And other people that you really trust, right? And so, because these are things that I say in an office all the time, right? To where I might say, I've gotten really good at rolling up my eyes in my head so you don't see it, but this time I'm going to roll my eyes because you're being ridiculous, right? And so, and then my mom's like, you need to calm down. No, I'm kidding. But I think it is, one is having a circle of friends, right? Or people that you trust, or people that you respect, and those kind of things. And I think even Islamically, right? If we get negative feedback, our first, theoretically, our first feeling should not be like, I'm going to get defensive and tell you why you're wrong. We should like reflect on that and say, okay, I don't see that, but how do I think about that? So part of it also is how do we train ourselves, right? In that sense of, okay, what's happening right now? I feel pretty good about it, but how's this affecting me? How's it affecting the people around me, right? Or am I finding the balance in all these things that I should be doing, or am I so focused on, this thing? And I think that's generally speaking, right? Because as you guys were talking, I was thinking of like J.K. Rowling, who I think everyone knows, right? And, was she a narcissist because she was in Europe and she was like, here, I wrote this book. I think it's pretty good. And every publisher, like 30 of them was like, no, it's no good, right? And then she like brings it to America and the rest is history kind of thing, right? And so, who knows? Maybe those publishers are like, oh my gosh, she was so pushy, that kind of stuff. But I think you have to reflect within yourself, right? Just kind of like, what am I doing? What are my goals? What is my motivation here, right? Is there goodness there, or is it something more or less than that? And then also, how do we, and I know with COVID it's been difficult and whatnot, but how do we create a circle of friends and family to where we can say, this is what I'm working on, right? And I know a lot of us have parents that are just like, no, you need to go to grad school. Like, okay. But, right, so, and then I think even journaling actually is something that's, talked about a lot, but not really used that much, because we can have a thought in our head, but when you have to write something down, it's way more laborious, right? I can think whatever and just talk. But when you have to write something down, there's multiple steps, right? First, you have to formulate that thought, right? Then you have to tell your brain, okay, get your hand to hold a pencil or pen and write it down, which takes way more time, right? And then you look at it. And so that's kind of like, almost like a mirror, right? If you write something and you're looking at it, you can see what exactly am I doing? And it allows you to reflect on it more. And so I think these are all ways, and there's many, many ways that you can kind of do this. But part of it is like, if you find yourself thinking about it too much or too little and those kind of things, to really reflect on it with people, right? This is how I feel about it. What are you guys seeing? And if someone gives you feedback, positive or negative, right, to recognize the person sharing this is someone that I trust and someone that cares about me and those kind of things. And how do we have this open conversation about it?
Yes, that also feeds into that idea of nasiha and advising, and how you choose the people that you surround yourselves with. That's probably a really hard task, easier said than done. But finding people, first of all, you have to be open to receiving criticism, which is probably the harder part, right? And be willing to surround yourself with people that can tell you you're wrong, or I disagree with you, or I think what you did was wrong and here's why, and to be able to listen to that. Like we have to condition ourselves to be those kinds of people. And I guess, one way to check that would be, do you just run away from someone who, criticizes you or gives you feedback, and find someone else who's gonna say what you want to hear, right? But kind of flipping that on the other side of things, when you're the person giving the advice, it also becomes important to make sure you do that the right way, right? Because we're all human beings. Yes, ideally, we should all take feedback in the perfect way and like be vulnerable enough that someone can say whatever they want to me, however they want, and I should be able to navigate and find the good in it, or is there good in it? Like be very like, objective and think about it. But the reality is we're human beings. So we are taught how we should advise one another. And ultimately, we advise one another from a place of care and concern. That's what nasiha is. Nasiha is deep care and concern and love for someone else and a desire for them to be better, right? And it shouldn't have nothing to do with you, with the person giving the advice. So if you're giving advice and there's a lot of like I being used, right? Like I think this and I think that and I think this, that's probably not good advice, right? It has to be, you should be thinking about the other person and their well-being and how they're being affected and why what you're telling them will benefit them and why maybe what they did wasn't good for them, and trying to do that in the most prophetic and kind way. But don't make advice about yourself. I feel like we often do that. And then obviously other people are not going to listen, and it just may not be as impactful.
People in our history, Islamic history, have always, especially leaders, and this is really difficult. How many of you guys consider yourself a leader in some capacity? Like you're an eldest sibling? Anyone here eldest sibling? Okay. Anyone here like married? Anyone here have kids? Anyone here like you have people who work under you at work? Or like you're an upperclassman at school? Or you're a teacher? Like everybody, like the point I'm trying to make is like, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Kullukum ra'in wa kullukum mas'ulun an ra'itihi." All of you are shepherds. So whether or not you acknowledge your leadership, like you are, really. Because somebody, whether or not you realize it, is looking up to you or will look up to you. And so your preparation for leadership starts hopefully before you take that position. And the greatest characteristic of a leader is being able to listen to other people. That's why Umar radiallahu anhu used to hold like these town halls where he would just let people tell him what was up. And as a leader, you have a million excuses to explain why something is the way it is. Someone comes to you and says, you know what, Ustad, like why are there crowbars falling from the ceiling right now during this event, And I could be like, well, you don't understand how hard it is. Do you think I like this place? Or do you think I like looking like this place is like a scary movie, like ending scene? Like, you think this is good for me? Like, no, I tried so hard. You have pizza, I didn't even finish it yet, right? There's as a quote unquote leader, and I don't use that in like the definitive way. I use that in a descriptive way. Like, there's a lot of ways that I could just say like, you don't get it, right? But it takes a lot of spiritual strength, and it takes a lot of, honestly, a little bit of confidence for you to be like, you know what? Like, I hear you, and you're right. It does. It really does suck when Dr. Toor is about to make a point and then a crowbar drops from behind you and you can't hear anything, right? And it doesn't mean necessarily that those other reasons don't exist, but it just means that you're willing to listen and you're willing to validate what that person's saying. And many of us, our arguments actually aren't us discussing anything. We're just restating the same points that we make over and over again. And the other person's doing the same thing. So it sounds like two people on repeat. There's not much construction happening, right? There's actually just destruction happening. It takes a lot more to build than it does to destroy, right? To build a wall takes more effort, material, and strategy than it does to knock it down. And so when it comes to what kind of markers are signs of healthy self-confidence, right? A self-confident person doesn't stop listening to people. The Prophet ﷺ listened. The women of Medina told him, Ya Rasulullah, we don't like the fact that all the men get to have classes with you. And we have to just kind of like find you when we can and ask questions. Can you imagine the Prophet ﷺ like hearing that? He could have been like, oh yeah, let me just ask Allah to create an 8th day so that I can teach you. Or like, let me just, you know what he did? He said, you're right. And then he picked a day during the week, I believe it was Tuesdays, and he said, this is going to be the day where I have a sisters only class. The women's halaqah at the masjid is a sunnah, by the way. Can you imagine the kind of humility it would take for a person who's been anointed by God, right? That his confidence level has been given to him by Allah. He is the most beloved of all mankind, all humankind. He knows he's going to paradise. He knows he's God's chosen messenger. And someone comes up to him and says, you could do this a little bit differently. And he does it, right? Now try to transpose that moment onto yourself. Like, how would you have responded? And your son's like, dal chawal again? Like, we're just gonna have rice and lentils again? And your kid's like, why? And you're like, you know what I mean? Or kid's like, Daddy, this chicken doesn't taste right. And you're like, it tastes fine, right? It's edible. Or they don't like some, I don't want to wear this, or this doesn't fit right or whatever. And you're like, no, it's fine. Not being able to even hear criticism has become like a hallmark of our society. Because it's the moment that somebody gives me feedback, it's a personal attack, and I can't tolerate that, right? Whereas Imam al-Ghazali said, even the even the drunkard can tell you not to drink. Do you know how crazy that is? You should not discount the advice someone is giving you, even if their personality contradicts what they're saying. You know, and we do that instantly. That's the number one discredit, right? The ad hominem. We go right against, you know, hey, you should really exercise. Really interesting that you're saying that, right? Java, like, you know, like you should really, you know, do that. And it's just like goes number one, back and forth. Really, you're one to tell me, Betty Crocker, like that I should stop eating brownies? And then the person's like, listen, I'm just trying to give you advice. And you're like, why don't you go look at the mirror? And it instantly starts going into personal attacks. And you know what? Nobody wins, just losers. Just losers. And that's how divorces happen. That's how parents and kids don't talk to each other anymore. That's how friendships end. That's how relationships, that's how people get fired, is because there's an unwillingness to listen. Even if you don't agree. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, palace in the middle of paradise, in the highest part, for the one who gives up arguing even when they know they're right. Because it is a truly divine skill. It's a very divine skill, right? We ask Allah Ta'ala to accept. That leads us to the next topic, which is turbulence in family relationships. Dr. Toor, I think, does anyone here, raise your hand if you've ever had a crisis at home? Okay, so this is important. I'm doing this on purpose. There's something in counseling called universality, which is like one of the most important tools, which is basically, everyone raise your hand if you've had a crisis at home before, ever in your life. Family crisis, ever. Okay, look around the room, everybody. No, keep your hand up. Look around the room. You know what this is supposed to do? It's supposed to allow you to feel the reassurance that you're not alone. Because when the crisis happens, like part of what Ustad Baylo was talking about, Shaitan loves hopelessness. So when the crisis is happening, Shaitan is like, man, your family is so messed up. Like, you guys are just messed up people. You know, don't tell anybody what's going on. And that's why, oh, should we maybe talk to a counselor? No, we're not crazy. Nothing's wrong with us. Like, really? Because you and Dad haven't talked for like 8 years. So like, maybe some therapy is good. No, it's fine, right? Just busy. You know, I cook, he eats. What's the problem? I don't think this is normal, right? So turbulence in family is something that is, by the way, it is in the Quran. Is it normal for brothers to want to kill their brother? Is that healthy, Dr. Toor? A group of brothers came in and said, we just threw our brother in a well yesterday, and our dad cried so much he went blind because of it. Like, you know what I mean? Or like, if you have like, you know, a father who's telling his son, like, get in my ship, you're gonna die, and he says, no, I'm good. Right? Or Ibrahim alayhi salam, his father says, if you keep teaching this stuff, I'm gonna kill you. Right? So oftentimes we run away from dealing with the turbulence in our homes, but we fail to realize that it is, Allah put it in the Quran for a reason, so that we can identify with it, address it, grow from it, learn from it. Can you talk a little bit about just family relationships and the turbulence that we experience and how to manage those things? We can switch mics, by the way, if you want to. I think this one's a little bit better.
You sure?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I think that was
Yeah, I got it. Go for it.
no, I think that was a good point, right? That idea of, and I'm certainly not a scholar, but right, the idea of whatever was revealed in the Quran was within a context. Right? There was always something happening where it's like, okay, I'll hook you up, right? And so this idea of family turbulence, clearly every family, hopefully people realize with all the hands up that every family has their issues and their dynamics and that kind of thing. I will say, usually when they make it to my office, right, like the house is already burned down usually, right? They're kind of like, how do you fix this? And I was like, you know, I don't know how to do that. But hopefully you guys in a month or so will be able to be like, we got it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that speaks to, we've talked about the uniqueness of each person, right? And the flip side of that is the complexity of each person, right? And so now, you know, put 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, depending what country you're from, 8, 9, 10, 11 people in a house, right? And it's like, there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of different communication styles, different ways to cope. I don't know if people, and I don't know enough about it to really talk about it, but birth order, things like that, you see kind of like elder kids tend to be this way, middle kids tend to be neglected, and younger kids tend to be, right, the baby and like, oh, the light of our eye, that kind of thing. And the other kids are sitting there like, okay, yeah, sure, I guess I'll go kill myself. That's fine. But I shouldn't joke about that. So, but what's really about it, right, is that idea of where does empathy play a role, right, in your life and in your family. And I know we've got generational issues and cultural differences, and if someone was raised in a certain time period and, you know, those kind of things and whatnot. But with that, right, is that idea of like the love we have for each other, right? And so how do we recognize that, okay, we have this turbulence or whatnot, maybe this isn't the best time to talk about it, right? And that doesn't mean, oh, we're never going to talk about this, forget it. But maybe proactively, right? Proactively make a rule in your family that if one of us says, okay, this is getting out of hand, maybe we should take a break, right? To be able to say like, okay, that's a reasonable thing. Right now, if your parents are like, have you done your homework? You're like, whoa, 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 this is getting out of hand. Why don't we wait till Monday? And so, but if you truly care about each other, right, and you truly agree on these things, then it is much easier to make these rules and implement them than if you try to do something in the moment, right? And we know when we're overwhelmed with our emotions in the moment, we usually say things that we regret, and then we're kind of like, well, I'm in too deep now. I've got to double down, right? I'm going to say even more horrific things, you know, that kind of stuff. And so, but to maybe talk about. So when I go home, like these guys have notepads and stuff. Like when patients say stuff to me, or if I'm just randomly, you know, thinking about things, I'll be like, oh, I wonder what I was like when I was 8 or 10 or 15 or 37 or, you know, all that kind of stuff. And then to be like, I'm going to ask my mom and dad, right? And they're two very different people. My mom was like a guidance counselor. Like, you know, if her grandchildren have not eaten within 4 minutes of getting to her house, it's like chaos. And then, you know, my dad is a chemical engineer. Any engineers here?
Any.
Okay. In my experience, not too much emotional intelligence. I'm sure you're very.
He's the exception. He actually is the exception.
I can tell by your smile, mashallah. That you do.
Yeah.
But my dad is, you know, I remember one time, my best friend when I was like 11 had called our house. His mom called our house, and even I could hear through the phone, and it wasn't a cell phone, it was one of those rotary phones with like a 47-inch extension cord, that kind of stuff. And I could hear my friend's mom really upset, and I obviously had a little bit of privy to it, and they were getting a divorce. And this is like the first time I've ever heard of divorce. And my mom was like, Linda, it's gonna be okay. Like, we're here for you. And my dad was like, I think it's time to eat. Can you do this conversation later? And even in that moment, I was like, oh my God, this is insane. Like, why would he say that? But how do you recognize kind of like, okay, each person is different, and how do we relate to each other? But if, in my experience, if you take a proactive approach, right? And it's the same thing in our faith, right? How many times are we kind of like, I promise I'll pray if I pass this exam. Look, I'm going to make up every prayer I've ever missed if like I totally get an A on this test, right? Like everyone's had, or if Tennessee beats Alabama, I swear to, you know, that kind of stuff. And so, but if we take a proactive approach, right, then we don't have those moments. We don't have that need of desperation and those kind of things. Now, you know, we're all humans, so of course, every once in a while, but I think you guys get the gist. And so as a family, even now I go back and talk about, you know, and obviously as a psychologist and whatnot, I'll talk to my parents about kind of like, you know, the way you communicate or the way I communicate or what was I like is this, and just creating kind of that environment where we can have this dialogue, and not when, you know, people are agreeing or disagreeing in the heat of the moment kind of thing, but just general kind of conversations about, you know, how we communicate, how we support each other, how do we love or show care for each other? Because we all know, you know, love, if both your parents are still here, or your siblings or uncles or aunts, they all show love differently, right? And so how do we kind of reflect on that and then emphasize it with each other in the sense of, you know, that kind of thing. But then also the self-care part is important too, right? If there's, you know, family turbulence and you have, you know, your own home or your own room or, you know, those kind of things, right? How do you use those things to continue to support your mental health and decompress and, you know, those kind of things? I know during Christmas, one of the things I talk about with people is like, okay, how's this week going to look and what's your escape plan?
Why
right?
Christmas? You highlight why Christmas? What's the
right? Because that's when most families get together,
yeah.
right? And they're like, oh, it's Christmas presents. Like we go in debt for, you know, to show this like superficial like love for you and that kind of stuff. I know that's not true for everyone, but there's a lot of like family time, right? And extended family time and all this kind of stuff. And you don't really have, for some people, you don't really have a relationship, right? A weekly kind of thing. Maybe someone flew in or you just don't. And so we talk a lot about proactively, right? And that it's okay to say, you know, I'm gonna take an hour and go for a walk, or, you know, do this thing or that thing. And so how do you find that balance between like quality family time or just family time and also taking care of yourself? And so.
Yeah, sure.
So this reminded me of a point you made very quickly, casually walking out of the house earlier today, which I've already forgotten what the point was, but I want to hear it from you again. But I think it's related to this this idea of like you were talking about self-care, or I think you were talking about venting, and that's something that we all sometimes think is self-care, right? Like there's a difficult situation, I'm gonna go to a friend and I'm just gonna vent about it, right? And I'm gonna clear my mind. It's gonna clear my thoughts. And we think we're doing something positive, but you made a point that literally I've forgotten half of it. That's why I'm really asking this question for myself. But like, how do we know how do we do that right? Right? There is a place for it, but how do we do it the right way?
Yeah, so we were obviously having a profound conversation about complaining versus processing, right? So how do we know when we're complaining about something versus part of my complaining is my process of healing or expressing myself or advocating for myself and those kind of things. And so, and I think that actually kind of gets back to the self-confidence part, right? If you're complaining about something, you tend to not feel better afterwards, right? Like you tend to sometimes feel escalated. So there's a lot of studies out there. Initially, it was kind of like, oh, if you're really upset, punch a pillow and imagine that person or that thing or, that kind of stuff. And research showed that actually made it worse, right? When you hyper-focus it onto this one thing. But if you have like a punching bag or exercise or whatever, and it's just generally done and not focused on someone's visual image, right? Then you do get this release and this decrease in stress and, those kind of things and whatnot. And so the processing part, right? If you feel like you've learned something, right? Or you've felt heard, right? Or you've been able to hear the feedback that you've gotten, you're probably processing it, right? Complaining is usually when you like steamroll somebody and they're trying to say something and and you're like, I'm not done yet. And you just keep going and going and you don't feel better afterwards and you don't feel heard, right? And you can usually, again, we've talked about kind of the mind-body connection, the spiritual, emotional connection. You can usually feel it in your body, right? If you're feeling more agitated or relieved or, those kind of things. And so these are all kind of ways to keep an eye out for it. And so I think that's kind of the gist of it.
That's interesting, actually. When you use the word processing, that was the word I was struggling to find that you mentioned earlier. I think an example of this we're talking about before also is the word complaining in Arabic is ashku. And one of the most famous places we see it used is when the Prophet ﷺ was at his lowest after Ta'if, after he got physically abused and beaten and literally he was bleeding, almost unconscious. He makes dua to Allah and he says, Allahumma ilayka ashku dhurfa quwwati. He says that, oh Allah, I'm complaining to you about my weakness, like about where I'm at. And what's interesting, if you go and read that dua from beginning to end, you actually see the Prophet ﷺ processing his state from the beginning to end. In the beginning, he's just laying out like exactly where he's at. He's like, I'm at my lowest. He says, oh Allah, who have you left me to? Did you give power to my enemies over me? Is this it? Is this where I'm going to be now? Then you see him like slowly, the processing you can see through the dua. Then he says, oh Allah, if this isn't your punishment, then I can handle it. If you're not angry with me, oh Allah, then that's okay. But it starts off from like, I'm at my lowest. My enemies just like, they overpowered me. I had no response. I couldn't protect myself at all. And by the end of the dua, he says something profound. He says, he says, oh Allah, you can do whatever you want as long as you please. I'm good. But it starts from like just real complaint, like real low. And then at the end, he's at a place of dealing with it. And then it adds a lot of perspective to what he does right after. The famous incident when the angels come to him and say, the angels of the mountain say, we can crush these people between the mountains. They live in the valleys. For what they did to you, your dua like shook the heavens. They can be crushed if you just give the green light. And the Prophet ﷺ says, no. Perhaps one day from their progeny, a believer will come, right? And that mercy that he chose in that moment, he went through this, like he processed where he was at through his dua to Allah, and then at the end he's able to show that like perfect, beautiful prophetic character that we see. But we sometimes just want the conclusion, but we don't want to do what he did to get there. He also gave us a roadmap of how to get from like your lowest and the most stressed and the most difficult situation to then responding with the most perfect prophetic character.
And crazy connection that I just made. Allah gave me, I should say. Self-doubt. Yeah, I'm amazing. Keep going. They love you. Everyone loves you. Okay, so this is confusing psychology stuff. No, crazy connection. So you talked about processing, how the Prophet ﷺ went through the process and then was able to have that like miraculous moment. And then, so the people of Ta'if, they were the ones who rejected him. And then they continued to reject, because Ta'if and Mecca were like twin brothers. They're like this, they're known as like the twin cities of the Hijaz. So like they're right next, they're like an hour apart. And they both, the tribe of Quraysh, Banu Thaqif, they both rejected the Prophet ﷺ until the very end, until basically the opening of Mecca. In fact, after the opening of Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ Muslims went to Ta'if, right? So what's interesting is that they eventually accepted Islam. Okay, so this is, we're talking like, 15 years later, they accepted Islam. And then the Prophet ﷺ passes away. And when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, there were many tribes, not many, there were some, that started to like internally negotiate their Islam, and they wanted to basically renegotiate that agreement. And they wanted to cut out certain things. Okay, like we'll be Muslim, but we don't want to pray, or we don't want to give zakat. That was a big one, zakat. Or we don't want to do this, or we don't want to have to fight in any battles if people attack us. Like we don't want to. So they basically wanted to conditionally accept Islam. Okay, now that unfortunate like thread was making its way through different tribes, and it reached the tribe of Banu Thaqif, those people. And you know what happened? When it got to them, there was some internal murmuring, like, yeah, we should do it. We should just dip. He's gone. Like he passed away. Like let's just. And one of the elders who was there at that time stood up and said, I'm going to tell you one thing and you better listen. We were one of the last ones to join. Like it took us forever to arrive as Muslims. Don't you dare be the first ones to leave. And they stayed strong, like because of that one moment. And that only happened because of the moment that the Prophet ﷺ went through. His appropriate processing of that moment led to them realizing how lucky they were through the statements of that one person. We are so blessed that Allah left the door open for us. We should not be the first ones to knock it down on the way out, right? Let the other tribes go. Let them all renegotiate their faith. Let them all display their true, insincerity in this moment. But we're not going to do that because we were one of the last ones to figure it out. Right? Amazing what can happen, the barakah, the blessings of like healthy emotional processing, right? Now we're talking about generational stuff, right? How many of us, we know that some of our behaviors or our thoughts are the product, for better or for worse, of processing or the lack thereof of our parents or grandparents. I was once talking to a girl who said that her dad never said, I love you. Anyone here share that, right? No, I love you at home, right? No one's gonna raise their hand. I mean, I'll tell you, my dad, he's an engineer, extremely loving guy. No, Jim Murphy is like one of the most loving human beings ever. He still tells me, he's like, I'm so proud of you for Roots and all this kind of stuff. He's very, mashallah. But I'll never forget, one day I attended a lecture and I was like, and the sheikh was like, you have to tell your parents you love them. You have to kiss their hands and feet and all this. And my dad's just like not like that. Like he can't kiss my dad's hand. He'll be like, oh, is there ketchup? Like he'll be confused, like what's going on. When I was sitting in like the chair, like we had a nice chair at home and my mom is Egyptian. And I'm sitting and my dad walks in, she's like, she's like, like get up, you disgusting human being, right? What have I given birth to? This is how Egyptian mothers show love. So she starts yelling at me, like just destroying me. And I'm like, Mama, it's okay. Hada. And my dad's like, sit down. It's fine, sit down. And my mom was like, la, abadan, ummi. And I'm like, who do I listen to? Like, my dad's like, stay seated. My mom's like, get up, you disrespectful. Did I raise an animal, right? Allah, just take me now, you know, like Egyptians are very emotional. And my dad is like, what are you doing? Like, just sit down. Because my dad, like, again, he's, you know, he comes from a different background. So my dad, I remember I was coming home from a lecture and the chef was like, you have to tell your parents you love them. So I was like, this is gonna be super awkward, but I'm gonna do it. And I said, Dad, I love you. And he said, thank you. It's better than I know. It's better than okay. He said, thank you. And again, like, you know, it's an appropriate response. Not the best, right? Silver isn't bad. Right? I was going for gold, but got silver. Maybe bronze, right? But it's interesting because, again, like, it's important to recognize that, like, everyone's parents really tried. And I remember I was speaking to this one girl and she was talking about that. And my dad never said, I love you. And it's very emotionally difficult. So I asked about, you know, she was she was angry. I mean, she was very angry at her dad, right? And she said, you know, I can't believe it. And this is unfair and this and this. And just, do you mind just saying the low power notification hanging okay on that? Sorry, Ernesto, you can hit it. Yeah. Because I know we're gonna get a lot of.
It says login.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go. Sorry, Instagram. So.
Hi guys.
You want to
So,
say the password out loud?
I asked her. I said, are you? Tell me about your grandfather, your dad's dad. And she said, well, he was like a general in the army, and like, you know, he was very stern. If there were couches in the room and people were sitting on those couches, no one could sit on the couch. We had to sit on the floor. If my grandfather was on the couch, like, for example, if this was the couch and Ustad Ubaidullah was the grandfather, like, no one could sit on the same level as him, because this was, again, like some sort of army protocol in the country where he was from. So I said, do you think that your dad ever heard I love you from his dad? And she started crying. And she realized in that moment that, like, I am the byproduct of my grandfather's inability to show love to my dad. And guess what? Her great-grandfather probably did the same thing. And it probably just kept going, right? So what we have to realize, especially in processing, is like, and this is what Dr. Toor said in the beginning, is like knowing your feelings, knowing what you're feeling, hearing your thoughts, being able to contextualize all of that, and understanding that the cards that you've been dealt from Allah, there is a narrative and a story and a tale behind each one of them. And in that moment, it doesn't mean that you let bad things happen to you. It doesn't mean that you lay down and take whatever abuse or oppression is happening, but it's understanding where everything is coming from so that you can process appropriately and respond according to an accurate, accurate narrative. So one of the last things I want to talk about, we talked about self-confidence, and I want to open it up to some questions, inshallah, as much as we can, is this idea of gratitude. You were really big on this idea of gratitude when we talked, and you said that gratitude is like one of the most important principles of mental wellness, right? That being grateful is something that everybody has to experience. And you mentioned something is, you know, you said, and you sort of alluded to this in the beginning, like mental health does not equal being happy all the time, right? So can you expound upon that statement? Can you illustrate to us, you know, okay, what is gratitude in the context of not being happy all the time? Like, how does a person balance? It seems like those are two opposite statements. So how does a person balance those two statements?
You know, that makes me think about, I know everyone knows the boxer Muhammad Ali, right? And so when, you know, part of his greatness, right, was telling everyone that he was great, right, and that he was the best and that kind of thing. And then, alhamdulillah, when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, right, what did he say about Parkinson's disorder? Does anyone? That's right. So Allah gave me this disease to remind me that he's the greatest, right? But he said it with a smile. He didn't say like, oh, I just put that in the L column, right? He didn't say like, I lost that. It was just like, no, alhamdulillah, like this is such an amazing thing. And so, you know, I think gratitude is wonderful. And, you know, there's tons of YouTube videos on gratitude and whatnot. I think that is one of those things to where, you know, from an Islamic perspective, right? We think of like dhikr and shukr and that kind of stuff and whatnot. But I shouldn't say stuff, you know, that stuff. But that's one of those things to where there's a fantastic kind of study they did where they're like, okay, think of someone that you're grateful they're in your life, and like people are kind of like blushing and giggling. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. And then they say, okay, now pretend you're going to write them a letter. So just write down, what would you say to them? Like, thank you for being in my life, or, you know, you're the reason I'm a teacher, or, you know, whatever it is kind of thing. And then they're like, okay, just read it out loud. Here's a camera, just read it out loud. And after every stage, they would measure kind of their emotionality and their level of gratitude and happiness and, you know, that kind of thing. And you can probably imagine after each stage it rose, right? That doesn't mean it stays forever, right? But by being that purposeful, it meant more and more each time, right? And then of course they said, okay, now we're going to call this person, and everyone's like, okay, has anyone seen this video? I imagine some people have. So some of these people are overseas, and it's like middle of the night, or I think in one case the person had already passed, and they're like, okay, maybe you can call. They're like children or something like that. So, and of course a lot of them were family members or people that they were friends with and whatnot. And so then they measured again, right? Like, where's your well-being? Where, your sense of feeling satisfied and whatnot. And after actually telling that person, right, that was their highest level of satisfaction, right? And not even happiness, right? But satisfaction in the sense of like relational connection. Like, I feel really connected to the person, or even vulnerability. A lot of times when we hear the word vulnerable, we think of like, close that door. Like, I'm not showing those cards, right? But vulnerability, right, can be a very powerful thing. And so, and that kind of underlies everything we've kind of talked about, whether it's self-confidence or whether it's motivation or whether it's gratitude. And so a lot of times people, if you're already feeling down about yourself, then it turns into, well, I'm not grateful enough. And that means I'm ungrateful, right? And that's kind of that linear thinking that we want to shy away from, right? That sense of like, even if I haven't expressed gratitude today, that doesn't mean I'm an ungrateful person. That just means, oh, maybe I can start now, right? Or I didn't write in my journal what I'm, thankful about, or, those kind of things. That doesn't mean I failed. It just means, oh, let me be more purposeful about it tomorrow. So even with my kids at night, we always say, what are 3 things you like about yourself? Or what are 3 things you're grateful for? And not to be sexist, but my daughter's like really thoughtful about it. And then my son is like, you can tell he just hits like the replay button. And he's like, oh, I'm thankful for this and food and school and Legos. And I'm like, okay, but every once in a while, right, he'll share something else. And the idea is like, how do we get into that routine of expressing gratitude and not think of it as like, if I don't do this, I'm a bad person, right? Because that's the other half of it. In that sense, and if we get to a really high place, inshallah, for everybody, when you can express gratitude for whatever happens in your life, good or bad, right? Because we talk, in our faith and right and whatnot, right? Like Allah is the best of planners. Whatever's happening, and this again speaks to my dad, the engineer. I have another sibling, and something in the moment that like a relationship ended for an older sibling of mine, and of course we have a WhatsApp group, which I'm sure everyone does. And I think like my brother like maybe posted that at like 2:57, and my dad at 2:58 was like, alhamdulillah, this is great for you. And I was like, oh my gosh, a little bit of tact. Could you wait like 4 minutes before you're like, sorry, that's over, but good for you. And so, but right, he was at a level to where he's like, whatever happens in your life is good for you. And so, and that doesn't mean we have to feel happy about it. We can still feel upset and sad and disappointed and every, painful emotion that we can. But if we can balance that with that gratitude part, right? That's that idea of, talking about that nuance, punishment versus merciful. In psychology, we call it ambivalence, right? And so we'll talk about ambivalence in the sense of being able to hold 2 emotions at one time that are contrasting emotions, right? And so just earlier, right, a young boy went out with his dad and he wanted to be with his mom, it seemed like, and he was upset about it, right? But he was still holding his dad in a loving way. And so that idea of like, I can be upset and I do not want to go with you, but, I can still sit with both of those things, right? He wasn't squirming or whatnot. And maybe he was like, well, this guy's physically bigger than me. There's nothing I can do. I'm 3, right? But and this is bringing up my own stuff, because my 5-year-old will come up to me and be like, Dad, just to let you know, I love Mom more than you. And he'll like walk off, and I'll be like, good talk. And so, right, but to be able to sit with that, and some people would be like, well, you're stupid and you're not getting chicken nuggets today, right? But to be able to say like, alhamdulillah, like he's able to express himself and those kind of things, although deep down I'm like, I'm gonna win your love. So I think that's the other part of the ambivalence, right? That idea. And when I spoke earlier, kind of under my breath about suicide, people hear that, right? And it's that idea of, right, how can you talk about something so serious, right? And if that offended anyone, I'm certainly sincerely apologetic about that. But like, how can you talk about this serious thing, whether it's depression or happiness or suicide or anxiety or whatever it is, but also sit with it and say, but it's going to be okay, right? And so, and that takes time, and that takes patience, and that takes routine, all these kind of things. And so if we master that, right, we get to a place to where it's like, I can be grateful for this thing that in my head, it's like, no, I'm not really grateful, but hopefully in my heart, I can connect with that gratitude. And then to be able to say like, inshallah, whatever's for the best, or, those kind of things.
What would you say to someone? Because on the gratitude point, especially when people are going through difficulty, the like Islamic setting response is read Quran, be grateful.
Right.
And someone who's like, we're like, okay, I'm not ungrateful, but I'm still feeling the way I'm feeling, and I don't know that you just telling me to be grateful is going to solve my problem. So like, where's the, you know what I mean? Like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I certainly don't advocate for what my dad did, and he does every time, where it's just like, my dad, my arm sticking out of my arm, or my bone sticking out of my arm, and he's like, alhamdulillah, good for you, you get to go to the hospital, right? But there is timing to lots of things, right? And we know even the Quran was revealed with like perfect timing. And so our words do matter, and it does take some reflection and insight and empathy to recognize, all right, is this what this person needs right now?
Also the right person too.
Right, and depending on my relationship with this person, right? Should I say this thing or should I not say this? I'm sure you guys have overheard a conversation or this or that, and you don't know the people, or you don't know them well enough, or you know them too well, and you're like, me, giving my 2 cents right now is probably not the best idea, right? And so I think that's the other part of it too, is that sense of, of course, if someone's going through strife in that moment, you don't want to say like, good for you, but if you can touch on that later and then talk about like, look how far you've come. I know we're still sad or upset or grieving or all these kind of things, but now you're able to at least have this conversation, right? And if I have to be explicit, I might say something like, and by me saying this, right, I'm not trying to downplay or illegitimize your feelings or whatnot. I'm just saying, can we like shift our thinking a little bit? We don't have to stay there, right? But if our thinking is kind of like a rubber band, and when we're grieving, it's like really tight, and I just want to focus on the grieving and the sadness and that kind of stuff. If I could stretch it a little bit, right, and well, they're no longer in pain, right? That's kind of like the cliche one, like at least now they're at peace, or those kind of things. But if you can shift it in the sense of, this kind of reminds me of when this other thing happened in your life, and how painful that was, and look where you are now, in comparison to that other thing. And so and then maybe you offer words of encouragement, like I just think it's really amazing that you can talk about this and those kind of things. So I think that's the other part of it too. Of course, if you come directly and just say like, you should be grateful over everything in your life, and you're like, well, this horrific thing happened. There's timing to everything, right? And we know with our brain chemistry, we know with our psyche, all those kind of things, we can only manage so many emotions at one time, right? Like our brain literally shuts off, right? If we're traumatized or these kind of things, like your brain goes into preservation mode, to where if you've ever known anyone or worked with people with trauma or have had your own, and a lot of times you don't remember the details of it, right? That's like Allah protecting you, right? And that sense of like, it's, your brain is saying, this is too much information, this is too much emotionality, and then it shuts down, right? And so to be able to think about it that way, in the sense of like, and of course, Islamically speaking, right, we'll never be given more than we can handle, kind of thing. And so that's like a really nice example of it too.
I wanted to open it up to questions from obviously the community. Anything that you guys came in wanting to ask or hear about, inshallah. Oh wow, okay, mashallah, we got a lot. All right, Hani, mashallah, the emotionally intelligent engineer.
So mental health is a very taboo thing in the culture that I come from. Just like we go to a doctor for a physical just to see if there's something wrong with us. As you mentioned, many times people come to you when it's already too late, or it's gone worse. Are there things in a clinical setting that you can come in for a mental health check-in to see where your mental health stands before it's too late?
Okay, so just to restate the question, mental health is like a taboo, experience or conversation, and seeking therapy is a taboo experience. And so just like we go to the doctor for checkups, like, is there that equivalent in the mental health world of getting a checkup?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know personally, I occasionally see a therapist for this exact reason. My wife will probably say, no, you need to see him for other reasons too. But the unfortunate part about it, is there anyone here that works for insurance companies or whatnot? Okay, and so my understanding, people Shame. My understanding of it is, at least in my field, you have to be diagnosed with something to get your sessions covered, right? And I say that, not in the sense of like complaining, but in the sense of like how we need to shift away from that. And so hopefully there's a lot of kind of like political stuff happening to where we're trying to do parity, to where if you go for an annual checkup or every, twice a year kind of thing, you get the same thing in mental health, to where, okay, how do you just go talk about your life? Right. And sometimes it feels really comforting knowing that it's just once or twice a year. And that's the other part of it too, is you control, how often you go, right? A psychologist or a counselor or whatever could sit there and be like, oh, you need to come weekly, or, that kind of thing. But that's totally, and I know there's a power dynamic happening, but that's totally up to you. And so I know for me personally, there's a really kind of light kind of disorder you can diagnose people with. It's called an adjustment disorder. And so basically you can relate that to anything. And so I've never been called by insurance. I'm like, what adjustment disorder are they having? And I'm like, I don't know, it was Monday and they were adjusting to like the weekend being over. And so, but I really do encourage people to go once or twice, and usually it is covered, or you can, find someone hopefully that has a reasonable fee and that kind of thing. And just to be able to think of it less as, of course, a stigma, and there is a big stigma right now. But I do think we're doing better. Like if you look at Islamic counseling and therapy and all the resources that are out there compared to like 10 or 20 years ago, I hope everyone can agree that it's gotten much better. And I think part of it is talking about, your mental health openly, right? In a controlled way, right? Not just to random people or strangers or that kind of thing. Because no one hesitates to say like, oh, I'll see you in an hour, I'm gonna go to the gym. Like, But when we talk about our mental health, right, rarely does someone say, I'm gonna go see my therapist for a minute, right? Or I've got this appointment and that kind of thing. And so if we can at least start that conversation, right? You don't have to go into everything you're talking about unless you feel the need to, but to be able to say like your mental health is as important as your physical health, right? When we look at the statistics in this country, how many people die by homicide every year? Any guesses? Someone say 1 million? No. Those are always my favorite answers because they're so absurd, but they sound kind of possible. And so there's probably 1 million people that are on someone's list of like, I wish they weren't there. But it's about 25,000, right, per year. So close, if you turn your page upside down and look at it, right? And how many die from suicide? You're like 2 million. It's about double, right? So when you think about that, it's really, hopefully it's kind of profound. And then when you look at kind of like the biggest killers of people, whether it's heart disease or obesity or organ failure or all this kind of stuff, I argue that that's a mental health issue, right? Some of it's genetic for sure, right? But a lot of these other things, right? If you're smoking habitually for decades, like that's not a genetic thing, right? I'm having difficulty coping with my feelings, and this thing kind of helps me with my anxiety or this or that or whatever. And so hopefully these statistics aren't depressing, but more like this is how important your mental health is. And so again, the other part of that too is being proactive about it, right? It doesn't have to be, oh, I just got clinically diagnosed with this or this, let's talk about it. It can even be like, yeah, when someone says, hello, how are you doing? Instead of the rhetorical kind of like, fine, this or that, maybe try saying like, oh, it's been a really rewarding day, or, nourishing day, or it's been kind of a down day, or, Ustad Mersh might have promised me like 80-degree weather and it's 37. And so like, that's kind of a sad day, right? And so if we can just make that a part of our terminology in our language, right, then it kind of takes away that stigma, right? It starts to, it's kind of there's a lot of examples that we don't have to go into, but if we can just become more comfortable with it, then maybe we get to a place where it's like, okay, instead of like, oh, what do I do with this? Should I talk to this person for 4 hours because they're really struggling? Or to be able to say like, oh, well, if there's anything I can do, let me know. I'm always here to listen, or this kind of thing. And so I think that's a big part of it.
Yes, I'm going to be after. Go ahead.
Sorry.
What's that?
So, sorry, I'm still
Just Abdurrahman, it's okay.
Names.
Sure.
You mentioned to be open to criticism regardless of who it's coming from.
Sure.
And going off of that, we live in an age where self-development and growth is huge, and that comes with like the willingness to always be open to accepting any type of criticism.
My question is, how to validate the source of criticism before we overanalyze every advice and criticism we hear in work, in our personal life, everywhere we go?
It's a good question. So the question is, basically, how do you filter through criticism to understand like what's valid, what's invalid? So I don't see criticism as like a binary experience. I take it as like an offering of food, right, or a drink or a dish. Like you can absolutely love a dish or absolutely hate it, or you can like certain parts of it and not like certain parts of it. So whenever I get feedback, as I'm trying to listen to it and process it and trying to really internalize it, I also, as a point of my own self-care and my own wellness, have to be honest about what I truly believe is not completely valid or relevant, right? Now that at the same time, the ambivalence of being able to say, well, I know that what this person is saying, I don't feel like that's accurate, but I can at least see where they're coming from, right? So someone's like, you know what, you never pay attention to me, right? Or like, you always walk away when, something's really important and like you're busy or this and that, right? I can say, yeah, I actually, going back now and looking at the last 3 conversations I had with you, at work or at whatever, I could see that. I could see why you see that. But in my own like understanding, I know that it was because like my son was sick or like my wife was calling or something, right? So I'm able to process what you're saying, not take it completely to heart, because I know that it's not as completely accurate and definitive and defining me as a person as what it's being said to me. But at the same time, I can understand and I can take from it what is necessary. Does that make sense? So if somebody says, for example, like, you really need to work on being more forgiving, right? Like I can say, well, I feel like I'm forgiving, but yeah, you know what? Maybe there were a few instances where I displayed, and so maybe then for me the advice is, okay, you know what? Like you have to work on your optics as well. Like you have to think about how you appear, your perception, as well as not just the advice, but also like how do you talk to people, right? Do you acknowledge their apology before you move on, or do you just say, okay, thanks, and keep going? So the moral of the story for me is that whenever anyone gives me feedback, there's a spectrum of 0 to 100 that you can accept that on, right? It should never be 0, right? There might be some people where it's like, yeah, that's good advice, right? 1%, there's a famous story of a man, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani is a famous muhaddith, and someone asked him, they said that, if I were, which one is better, your beard or my dog? It was a person who had a dog, and he was trying to mock him. So who's better, your beard or my dog? And this obviously is like an insult, right? Like it's not meant to be serious. The person was trying to mock the scholar because the dog obviously is considered maybe, having some impurity to it or something. So he listened and he said, you know what? It depends. And the guy who was trying to ridicule him was like, what do you mean it depends? Like, what are you trying to pull here? And he said, no. If I go to hell, your dog definitely wins. Like my beard is in hellfire. Your dog is the winner. But if I go to Jannah and I'm with the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? Not saying the dog's going to hell, but if I do, then I beat the dog, right? My beard is better. The point of that story is that like he heard this clear mockery, this joke, this attack on him, this verbal attack, and he still like considered it. You know what I mean? He still thought about it, entertained it, right? For the sake of, even if it's like a rhetorical entertainment, like, okay, let me think about this. The point that I was trying to make was, I don't think any of us have that skill mastered, let alone like genuinely listening to people when they're like actually right. Like, I think that's what we're really missing, which is like being able to listen to those people who are closest to us, whether it's like my parents, right? My siblings, my spouse, my kids, my son who's 5. Do I just dismiss everything he says as like, oh, you're a child? Or do I actually listen to it and like, okay, you know what? Like, I know that you're a kid, you don't understand that Baba is not Elon Musk. I can't buy you all the Legos. But when maybe he sees me walking in with like 3 Nike bags and like, I'm buying myself shoes and, whatever. And he's like, you never buy me anything. And I'm like, maybe kind of right. Like, I do buy myself a lot more than I buy you. And you're seeing that. And so now I have to think to myself, by the way, this is all fictional. None of this is true. Okay. So, but being able to at least address that on a scale. If I don't take it 100%, that's fine. But at least let me see where it falls on that scale just so I don't outright deny somebody their feedback like completely in totality. Allah, I hope that helps. Any questions at all? Yeah.
You guys mentioned something about when there's a clash or something, saying like, okay, let's talk about it later. How do you deal with somebody, or if you are that someone who cannot, if a clash occurs, they cannot rest or go to sleep until like it's even down to the lowest level? Like, what are some tips that you would give to a person who can't go to sleep? That clash is not figured out until the end.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, because I think it's something a lot of people can relate to. The question basically is, right, like, we talked about, take a break. If it's too hot, like, don't talk about it. But then there are people that can't sleep, right, until it's resolved or until you're so exhausted that you just kind of pass out, right? So that's kind of the thing. Well, and I think the first thing is, if this is a pattern that's happening, you're going to have lots of chances to fix this, right? Because it's continuing to happen. So that's the great thing about it. A lot of times you get people and they're like, oh, this thing happened, but I'm forgetting what happened. And I don't know, I wish I would have had my session 3 days ago. And I'm like, don't worry, it's going to happen again. Like, we're going to have plenty of opportunities. And so in this case, right, to really reflect on a couple of things. One, what's the feeling underneath that, right? Because sometimes we learn in different ways of communicating. And if you have children, a lot of kids communicate by, I'm going to ask for this thing 612,000 times until I wear them down. And then my parents will just be like, okay, fine, go watch, Predator or Terminator or, that kind of stuff, right? But the other part too is what is meaningful about that, right? What is meaningful about, we have to talk about this today, right? What does that say about my personality, my pattern, my preferences, and, those kind of things? And if I'm stuck in my way, am I being empathic in this moment, right? Because the other part of that too is, if you say, hey, let's talk about this later, I never suggest to say, let's talk about it later. I always suggest to give a firm time, right? And so not like, oh, at 8:35, we're going to talk about this, but to be able to say maybe after dinner, and it can be, we can revisit it. It doesn't have to say, okay, I've got 2 hours to get my legal team together and come up with my argument and that kind of thing. It can be like, let's check in with each other in a couple of hours, because right now it's way too hot or it's way too overwhelming, or, that kind of thing. And let's just see where it's at. Now we can find, if it's like, oh, let's check in tomorrow, and you keep kind of kicking the can down the road, so to speak, then that's something different. But if it has to be talked about in the moment, or you can't go to sleep, then I think the other part too is like, how do you find rest, or how do you find peace within yourself, knowing that there's this thing that is unresolved, right? Or that's something that has not come to finality, and still being able to fall asleep, right? Because the other thing about sleep's really an interesting thing, to where when we sleep, that's actually a very repairing kind of process, right? So throughout the day, right? That's literally that. Throughout the day, we're thinking, we're doing this, we're doing that, and our cells are dying, right? Or they're being damaged because they're being used, and neurons are being fired, and all this kind of stuff. When we get good sleep, right, that repairs that. It helps form memories and that kind of thing. That's why when sometimes you do something and then you wake up and you're like, oh, that makes sense, right? Or, oh, that's not bothering me immediately like it was the night before. That's because your brain is doing all this stuff while we're sleeping. I mean, the human body is the most advanced machine we're ever going to see. And so, but if you find that, right, to be able to really ask yourself, what's the emotion going on underneath? If I can't sleep, clearly it's still bothering me. And so, but sometimes just getting validation, like, hey, this is still bothering me. I'm not saying we have to talk about it, but maybe we can talk about it tomorrow. Or I'm going to write down my thoughts and I'm going to leave it on the dresser, or, here or there, as long as it's respectful, right? Not like, guerrilla warfare. They're like, have a good day, right? The person's like, crumpled in the corner, not able to function. But to be able to say, okay, what is this really about? And so, and is it the end of the world, right? Like, if we don't talk about it today, does it really have this kind of impact? Or when you do beat it to death, like, have you come to, is this complaining or processing? Have you come to some level of agreement? But I think, to be honest, I think there's an empathy component to it, right? To where if someone's like, I have to do this, I don't care how you feel about it, it has to be this way, even if it feels right, right? There's this lack of like, well, what's this experience like for this other person, right? And so that's something I think to kind of reflect on.
Thank you. Come here and then we'll go. Yeah.
Okay. So Assalamualaikum. I have a question. How do you not feel guilty when processing that you're complaining about Allah?
Oh, this is you.
Just because he literally said this earlier. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
I was like, whoop.
You know, we were talking about this earlier, this exact thing, that's why they're laughing. But I think the keyword is exactly in something you said, right? So it's literally a matter of that word that you put after complain. You can, and we see this in the example of the prophets, and throughout the Quran, especially before they make du'as or while they're making du'as, like almost every time, they're usually are complaining about their situation, right? They're complaining about something and they're complaining to Allah, right? So that's the key thing is, as long as you're complaining to Allah about anything, that's fine, versus complaining about Allah. If you make Allah the object of your complaint, then that's going to be a problem. But as long as you are complaining to Allah, and then the things you're complaining about are things, circumstances, situations, but you're seeking your solution with Allah, or you're looking for comfort with Allah, then it's fine. And literally the Prophet ﷺ, the same dua I was referencing earlier, he opens with that line. He says, Ashku ilayka dharfa quwwati. He says, I'm complaining to you about my situation. And then he even kind of, says like, I'm in this situation, did you give my enemies power over me? But he's not complaining about Allah's decree, he's trying to process, right? In his complaining to Allah. I don't know, hopefully that makes sense. Just said to and about way too many times.
Yeah.
Until we lost it in there somewhere.
Or Zakaria, when he's describing his body and he wants to have a kid, so he's like describing almost like the way Allah, like his state of being, and he's saying like, this is how I am. And then he finishes by saying like, but I know that you're not gonna let me down. You've never let me down before, and I made dua to you. So it's Allah actually, the hadith says that Allah loves when we complain so that he can help. But like complaining about somebody is different than complaining to somebody. So it's just understanding that the solution lies with Allah. He's not the problem. And understanding that your complaining is not resentment towards Allah. It's frustration with the world, which is totally fine. Like it's okay to be frustrated with the dunya. It should frustrate you. It's by design. Like the dunya is not the greatest place in the world. Well, I mean, it is the world, but it's not the greatest place. And so like, yeah, you're allowed to be upset with it. You're allowed to be frustrated by it. And just being like, okay, you know what? Like this is, I just want Allah to like help me here, and just being able to deal with it, and process in that way, and complain to Allah and trust that Allah Ta'ala will facilitate. Really, and that's where you conclude, is that you just have tawakkul at the end of it. Like, okay, I'm done my complaining. I'm upset. I'm frustrated. I don't want to be sick. I don't want to be, unemployed. I don't want to be looking for a house and not getting it. I don't want to be losing this, or I don't want to be fighting with my family. Oh Allah, this is the situation. Like, please help me. And then just go to sleep. Apparently, right? That's, no, it's interesting. It's really interesting, man, because it's sleep, the research behind sleep, and then finding out about like, the Prophet ﷺ would pray tahajjud after sleeping for a little bit. Right? It's so interesting, man. Like you wake up and like your mind is fresh, your heart is fresh, and you're able to like articulate yourself in a way. Even after a long day, it's hard. You just need downtime, right? And we think that like watching TV or something is downtime, but your mind is still being used. You need to like shut it down, right? And so I love hearing stuff like that, because I'm like, subhanAllah, it's just absolutely amazing. Even the midday nap, the Prophet ﷺ would take qaydula, lay down and rest. So, but I would focus on learning how to talk to Allah about the problem, not complain about Allah. Yeah. Well, yeah.
So you kind of mentioned in building self-confidence to listen to your own, kind of get in tune with yourself, and like when hungry, you learn how to listen to those cues. But what if you don't even trust your cues? Like physical example, like, oh, am I hungry or nauseous? Like emotionally, how do you even begin to trust that?
Yeah. So the question is, how do you learn to trust your cues if you don't necessarily like trust them all the time? Because Dr. Toor mentioned in the beginning, like learning how to listen to yourself, listen to your body. So yeah, and we'll wrap up with this, inshallah.
No, that's a really good question. And one thing I wanted to say about the previous one really quickly, about like, if I go from like, life's not fair and nothing goes my way, and I thought Allah was like undefeated, and why is he not doing anything for me, right? That might be a sign that you're feeling emotionally overwhelmed, right? Because when we talk about moderation and finding balance, when our thoughts start to go to things that when we're in a calm place, we don't believe, right? Then it's probably a sense that our emotions are, and there's nothing wrong with emotions. I love them. I'm pro emotions, but it's probably too much in that moment, right? And so, okay, what do you do in that situation? The first thing is you just did it, right? You just stated, or for your friend or whoever, right? That like, okay, this is something that's important to me. And so just by stating it trains your brain that like, I'm not going to shy away from this. Like, I'm going to be thoughtful about it. I'm going to be very courageous about it, because it takes a lot of courage to say, I'm struggling with this, or I'm struggling with that. I'm struggling with this, right? And so even if you post it on an anonymous Reddit forum, and so because your friends will find you. So that's the first step, right? And then to really, in that moment, and even if you have to do it afterwards, reflect on like, where was I emotionally in that moment? Right? And to just kind of sit with that. And so that was just that one thought. For not knowing, how do I know this cue is right? Right now we're getting to like existential stuff, like what is the real world, meta, all that kind of stuff, right? It's kind of the same thing, right? Am I nauseous or am I hungry? Right? Or am I full, and that kind of thing. And so just to kind of reflect on your real world, right? Like, when is the last time I ate, right? Or this kind of thing, or that kind of thing. And so, and that's an easy one, because with food, you can say like, well, I ate at 6 o'clock. But with self-confidence, right? That's much more difficult, because you don't have kind of like a self-confidence meeting or, that kind of thing. And so again, I think that's where we're kind of reflecting with your words, right? I think certainly making dua, and, a lot of our answers or our prayers are answered in that sense, and that kind of thing. But to really be thoughtful about, well, how do I feel about myself right now? Right? How do I feel about my abilities to, whatever it is, be a good coworker or a human being or a Muslim or, a family member, these kind of things and whatnot. And so, and then to really identify what is self-confidence. Is self-confidence going in to every situation feeling like I'm going to win, or going in knowing that my intention is going to be acknowledged by my creator? Right? And recognizing that like, I'm going to do my best. And if I do my best, I feel good about it. And I think that's something that I don't know if we've been taught that from a very early age, if there's parents out there, or if you're still impacted by your parents, right? To be able to say, how do we shift the conversation from like successes and that kind of thing to a successful effort, right? And so if you're really putting in that effort, right, to really reward that and praise that part of it, because if you're studying for a test and you're really proud of yourself for that, more than likely you're going to do well on the test, right? If you put in that effort. So we really want to go to that part of the process, to where how do we reward ourselves and praise ourselves for really doing well. I think the other part of that too is to reflect on kind of your early life, and to be able to say like, what was self-confidence like in my family? Right? Like growing up, was it, that quintessential story of I got a 98 and your parents were like, where are the other 2 points? Right? And you're like, oh, it was out of 96. And they're like, where are the other 4 points? And you're like, okay. And so to really think about what is confidence meant to my family? Right? So conversation I have all the time. What did emotions look like in your family growing up? Right? Like, were they expressed? Were they not expressed? Were they, when you were vulnerable, were you made to feel little or critical or criticized, or, those kind of things? And so really and if you've got siblings or whatnot, to have those conversations, right? Like, what do you, and again, it's that Nia, right? It's like, let's not gang up on mom and dad, but to be able to say like, let's have a thoughtful conversation about, alhamdulillah, our parents are our parents and they did their best. And I think when you become parents, you recognize that like, you just do your best. And sometimes it's really bad and sometimes it's really good. But to be able to say, if these themes continue to come up for you, right? Whether it's self-confidence, whether it's self-esteem, whether it's like a harsh ego, or being like really self-critical, to say, question you might ask yourself, say, who else sounds like this? When I'm having this thought in my mind, who else sounds like this in my life? Right? And you might say it's nobody, but sometimes if you give it enough thought, something comes to you, right? And then to really be thoughtful about, has it just been like this for so long that now it feels normal, right? And a lot of times you see that with abuse, to where it's like, oh, they're just upset, and in a day or two it'll be fine and the swelling will go down, and you get to a place where it's like it feels very normal. And so, and then if we get to a place of healing, we can think about, how does that really affect me? Right? How does it affect how I see a potential partner, or when I feel angry, do I feel scared, or do I feel out of control, or do I feel humiliated, or whatever it is, kind of thing. And so Yeah, just to reiterate, I think that self-confidence part is to look at the successes in your life as well. Because I think everyone here, even if you may not feel successful, you've had successes. And so to not just focus on the perceived failures, but to also give time and energy and reflection to your perceived successes.
Anything? How many cats do you have? 2. Okay, 2 cats. All right. Well, Jazakallah khair, everybody. I know we went a little bit over time. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. Salmaan, he came straight from the airport, and he's I can disclose. He's had a GI bug all day. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. His drink is water with Pepto-Bismol in a Sprite can or something, a Sprite bottle or something. Yeah. So he's struggling. He's struggling today. But mashallah, he came through and you couldn't tell. Really appreciate everyone coming through. Jazakallah khairan to the community for coming and, talking and learning and listening and benefiting, inshallah. I hope that you guys enjoyed. You guys enjoyed Dr. Toor's thoughts? Yeah, alhamdulillah. So then tomorrow morning, we're going to be having a workshop on some of the prophetic parenting practices, particularly things that I learned from, Dr. Toor, just by observing him, spending time with him, being friends with him. Don't ask my kids if they work or if I do them, but no, I'm joking. But things that I really admired, mashallah, just as a pre-dad married guy, that was when I have kids, inshallah, I want to be able to do that. Or, I would see something that, he would say and be like, oh yeah, there's a hadith about that or something. So we decided to do a small little workshop. We'll have some donuts, bagels, and coffee, and we'll talk specifically about some of the principles of parenting. So if you have kids, or maybe if you have kids on the way, this might be a good time to come, inshallah, and benefit from that. So we appreciate you guys. We hope that Allah Ta'ala blesses everybody here, gives everyone a safe journey home, inshallah, and allows us to leave this gathering free of any sin that we have acquired or accrued. And then we ask Allah Ta'ala to accept all of our efforts and deeds. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. Jazakumullah khairan. We'll pray Isha in 5 minutes, inshallah. So for those who want to pray Isha, inshallah, we'll pray together. Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Assalamualaikum, how are you? Alhamdulillah, good. Iman? Okay, you want to go with Mama?
Yeah.
You want to stay with Papa? Oh, okay, you want to stay with me. What's up?
I just moved here.
Oh, nice, okay. Okay, let's look good.
I feel like today was almost very time.
There's certain things that he said.
Bye. See you tomorrow. Which one do you need me? Promise? I'm gonna ask you.
I think they're directors. I think they have an office director. Yeah. So what I think it is that that you reach out to, they need appointments or want to get a therapy session that maybe don't know where or how to pay for it. But I think they also have resources for up and coming clinicians. So I would reach out to them and ask. Yeah.
Are there directories within the head? You can go and have directories per state. And sometimes you can just
I caught someone
usually they're really
Welcome to Dallas. Assalamualaikum. I do. How are you?
Hey, hi.
I would ask him. But I would ask him. Yeah, let me ask him.